Remember Hello Neighbor? Of course you do. It was one of the biggest indie horror games from 2017 that had debatedly one of the best ideas for a horror game I've ever seen. However, fast forward to now in 2022, the franchise as a whole has seemingly fallen off into irrelevancy. But regardless of the title status, throughout the next few months, Hello Neighbor could potentially be preparing to make its next leap, and hopefully even make a full-blown comeback once again with a brand new sequel coming out soon. Now, before going into this big sequel, let's recap what we have so far with the series. So, of course, everyone watching probably knows the first Hello Neighbor game. It started as a small prototype developing into the well-known alphas, followed by betas, and of course a full game. Now, obviously, the game ended up peaking around this time, and after a slightly controversial final rollout, slowly the title began to decline, as honestly expected with a game that had came out and lived its life already. But this was only the beginning of Hello Neighbor as a franchise, as following this title's release, we saw the game's first spin-off called Hello Neighbor Hide and Seek, taking a new approach to the original game while keeping similar basic concepts like being chased and hunting for items through puzzles. Fast forward a few years, we ended up receiving Secret Neighbor. This game was by far the most ambitious, as for the first time Hello Neighbor was seeing a multiplayer element added to it, but honestly, this just made it even worse, and it wasn't all that popular of a game. Now, these were all considered spin-offs, games that were meant to be extras to the original Hello Neighbor and weren't necessarily full-blown extensions of the franchise, at least to as large of an extent as the next title I'm going to be discussing, that of which being Hello Guest. Now, this game started as a prototype and eventually went into alpha, and in some instances, for whatever reason, they referred to this game as Hello Neighbor 2, sort of confirming that this was really going to be the first fully fledged sequel to the franchise. And these weird references to that name would foreshadow a few months into the future, because eventually the developers announced that Hello Guest wasn't being worked on anymore, with the unveiling of an ambitious open world experience called Hello Neighbor 2, respectively. This game featured a character named Quentin, presumably trying to save the neighbor, as the concept of the original game was literally flipped on its head, as rather than trying to investigate your neighbor's basement, you were trying to save that same neighbor from the top of the house in the attic. This game follows some incredibly similar rules to the original Hello Neighbor. Look through the house, run from the bad guy, unlock the keyhole, and be super disappointed with what you finally see. Now, this new title has had two versions so far. The original Alpha 1 released on the announcement date, and then an Alpha 1.5 later on that was more or less just a minor update to the original, with some new small mechanics and a Halloween theming. And by the way, just to mention, they also released a game around this time called Hello Engineer as a temporary Stadia exclusive title that honestly I would say is one of the worst games I've ever seen. But anyway, around this time, Hello Neighbor 2 had gotten a decent bit of hype, mostly from the general community of people who've stuck around for the title since its heyday years ago. But for once, I think that things may actually line up for Hello Neighbor to once again see the light of day with this new release since 2017, as a lot of things are surprisingly working well to help this title release successfully to the actual mainstream, assuming everything's done correctly. So currently, where Hello Neighbor has been standing for the past year or so has been pretty damn disappointing, as while this Hello Neighbor 2 was a pretty relevant topic when it first came out, that final Alpha 1.5 update was released to celebrate fall of 2020. So well over a year at this point. And up to where we are now, that is the only playable update that we've had with this game, which is a crazy amount of time, honestly, especially when considering the title's next update was supposed to be a second alpha during that same winter, that of which is already long past. And funny enough, back during this time when I used to only make Hello Neighbor videos, one of my theories behind these long wait times was actually that this long-awaited second alpha wasn't ever going to happen. And instead, I was at least hoping that the game was going to extend beyond this Alpha 2 and go straight into beta. And surprisingly enough, over a year after I made that video, it turned out I was for the most part correct about this statement. Just a few weeks ago, after quite a few teases in regards to a Hello Neighbor 2 update, we finally got an official announcement on this game's next release, and it was expected to be a huge one. According to these announcements and a trailer that was released with the game, Hello Neighbor was going up for pre-order this year on April 7th. And as a mega bonus, everybody who pre-orders the game at this time will get access to the game's beta. Now, with everything we've seen with this Hello Neighbor 2 beta, it's pretty clear that the direction for this title has entirely changed again. The neighbor takes over once again as the main antagonist of the game, along with other members of the neighborhood. And your job as the player is to investigate the neighborhood in its entirety in an open world style of gameplay with tons of puzzles and AI mechanics, allowing for a huge huge title that looks like it's gonna be like 10 times bigger than the original game. Now, it's safe to say that for the most part, despite the attention Hello Neighbor 2 actually got, people weren't necessarily too impressed with the alphas because for the most part, they were very similar to the first game, just with a different approach and slightly better graphics. But just looking at what we have for this new beta, it is clear as day why this title took so long to have any updates. And it's looking like Hello Neighbor might be gearing up this year to finally make its resurgence if done correctly. Because I mean, look at this game just visually compared to the first game. The difference in quality and detail is night and day. Despite the lackluster work done towards this franchise in a lot of different aspects after the first title, this finally feels like the all-in game from TinyBuild. Now, with all this being said, this game does look amazing and it seems like there's quite a bit of potential, but everything has to be done correctly for this to work, which is definitely not a guarantee, especially for TinyBuild. So what I mean by correctly is first off with the actual game, because while it does look good, it actually has to play good as well, obviously. So a new approach is being taken with this title, and while the idea itself on concept is definitely pretty good with this whole open world multiple home thing, it also has to make sure to not turn into an overambitious mess where the game just comes out as more of an unfinished idea rather than a complete game. But in my opinion, the most important thing is that this game has to be polished and well made when it comes to management of glitches and bugs, because whenever I think of buggy and annoying, the Hello Neighbor franchise is what always comes to mind. The AI has consistently been horrible, the game mechanics have always been buggy and messy. Every single time, the games have failed to improve with bug management, and I'm not going to be giving Hello Neighbor 2 any excuses anymore. Because every time a new prototype or alpha or even beta for this game came out and ended up being incredibly buggy, it was super easy to be naive and brush it off as a game that was yet to be finished and therefore bugs were to be expected. But the issue is, once these games were actually completed and left the in development phase, the quality issues were almost never solved and sometimes got even worse. And this is a problem even this new game's alpha is shared, and if this still continues into the beta, I think that already could be the killer of this game, as if it wants a second chance, for just once we need a game that is well polished, at least to the point where the game can be played without the fear of everything in the map randomly falling through it. Another thing that could determine this game's success is with how it actually even ends up being released. Because honestly, it might not matter how good the game is if it isn't rolled out correctly. But this field is where I think more than anything TinyBuild is actually doing a great job. They've been giving us a ton of information recently about this brand new game, showing video developer logs along with trailers, and there's even been raw community interaction in places like their Discord where they give more extra little insights on the title's development. Which in this day and age where it's a trend to just tell people nothing about anything, it's a big breath of fresh air. Another thing that gives me hope for this title in the marketing aspect is just simply the name of it being Hello Neighbor 2. There's been so many spin-offs with weird, less appealing names, and especially for casual players and viewers, these can get super confusing, because none of these other smaller titles are in any chronological order. But just going with the simple name of Hello Neighbor 2 makes this game so much more distinguishable as a title. It's the next full Hello Neighbor game. None of this Hello Guest, Hello Neighbor, Goodbye Neighbor, Secret Neighbor weird naming scheme they've been doing. Just plain and simple. Hello Neighbor, but the second one. I'm sure this seems like something that in the grand scheme of things won't even matter that much, but especially on YouTube and other video platforms, it's bound to be a more intriguing game to make videos about just for the title alone. Which is super important, because if TinyBuild can get people like Markiplier and MatPat to cover this game without begging them to do it on Twitter, there could be so much potential for this game to blow up just like how the first one did, by blowing up on YouTube and making it an unavoidably popular game on the platform. But we won't really know how the game turns out doing until it comes out, of course. So we'll see this April if the game actually ends up being super successful, or if Hello Neighbor will once again fail to rebuild their initial hype all the way back from 2017. But to hear my thoughts on the first Hello Neighbor and its ambitions/issues, check this video here, and peace out.